Well, thank you all so much for coming here. This event is something that Chris and I have talked about doing for a long time. In fact, we were in the planning stages of doing a sort of lecture talk like this just before COVID hit. In fact, the last conversation that Chris and I had on it was hiring a bartender, and then all of a sudden. And since then, although I've had a lot of work in the gallery, what I haven't had is what I have now, which is a body of work with some consistency that is approached in a similar way, something that I could talk about in a very specific manner, and use it as a launching point to talk about what it is that I do in a more general sense. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and start this presentation here. That's me. Now, I'm going to mention this just as a little peek behind the curtain. I had this presentation. I'm not worried about talking to you due to my unfailing sparkling conviviality. But if this presentation, in terms of the slides and the order and everything, seems a little bit unpolished, it is because I lost my entire presentation 10 minutes before I was supposed to get into the car and come here. And I madly dumped all of my raw data onto my laptop and then tried to rebuild it as best as possible in the car driving over here. So if there are any elements of this that just seem a little bit wonky, that is why. And I appreciate your patience. So that out of the way, what I'm going to start with, this lecture is kind of in three parts. Part one is similar to an introduction that I gave some number of years ago when I was asked to give a lecture at the National Museum of Wildlife Art in conjunction with Western Visions. I was one of maybe like 5 artists that was asked to be part of the programming before the event and talk about what I do. And I decided that rather than just talk about hi, I'm Andrew, and this is what I do, I will talk about myself within the context of the broader contemporary wildlife art movement, which was very strategic of me because the National Museum of Wildlife Art, having purchased my work for their permanent collection and other sort of more modernist wildlife painters, was clearly aware of the shift in the wildlife art genre towards more contemporary modes of expression. But it wasn't something that was actively discussed. And it's been a huge paradigm shift that has happened just within my lifetime. And I thought, well, if they're unfamiliar or not fully acquainted with how important and how significant this is, well then I'm going to use this talk as an opportunity to do that. So I'm going to begin by talking a bit about what is contemporary wildlife art, how does that fit within the broader constellation of wildlife art, how do I fit into what we are broadly calling contemporary wildlife art, and then from there I'll talk about sort of the body of work that I'm working on currently. Those are the pattern series which you see sort of the culmination of here, and then I'm going to launch into a more detailed view of the actual process of the painting that I use. I am working on, with the large saguaro painting you see, I have recorded every step in that process. It's hundreds of hours of video. I have done sort of time-lapse compilations showing the creation of a piece from start to finish before. This is the most detailed attempt that I've ever undertaken to do that. The painting itself didn't get finished for this event, so the video sure as hell isn't. But what I am promising to all of you is that when it is finished and is uploaded to my YouTube channel, you will hear from Chris, you will get a link, everyone will have the opportunity to go in your own time and watch that video all the way through. My guess is it's going to run about a half an hour, something like that, which is probably more than I'd want to show here today anyway. I'd rather just talk to you. So, if you don't, there we go. All right, so talking a little bit about, I'm not a fan of computers today, so talking a little bit about wildlife art. So wildlife art begins in a very specific way. Now obviously, with cave paintings of Lascaux, animals have been a very significant subject of art since the inception of art. And yet, wildlife art exists in this weird kind of ghetto. It's sort of like the redheaded stepchild of the broader art world. And that largely has to do with in a more narrow view, what we think of as wildlife art as a quote-unquote genre, which is not really exactly the right term, because wildlife art is a subject that appears in multiple genres. But when we talk about, I'm a wildlife artist, he's a wildlife artist, Bob Bateman is a wildlife artist, we are talking about something very specific that we could sort of shoehorn into the more narrow definition of a genre. And the reason that that type of art has been sidelined is for these reasons, I think. First of all is that, oh, come on. Pardon me for just a moment.
You need a 12-year-old.
This is that, yeah, probably. This is that moment in the presentation where everyone's just staring at it. It'll be up in a minute. Hang on a second. All right, so wildlife art really begins with science illustration. And you have to understand that, when Captain Cook was sailing around the globe and people were bringing back exotic animal specimens from all over, there were a lot of things that couldn't be preserved very well. And the best tool that we had, photography not really existing yet, was for artists to come along in these exhibitions and draw or paint what they saw. And so science illustration is really where wildlife art sinks its roots. It's not a long trip from there into sporting art, where this started to, this notion of like illustration started to cross over into illustration of scenes. The old Currier and Ives prints are great examples of this, where there is an illustrative aspect, but it's also directly related to animals as subjects for sport or hunt. And then from there, we move into the mid to late 20th century. We start finding what I refer to as sort of ecological wildlife art. Now, this actually starts to happen in the late 1800s to very early 1900s. Artists like Willem Kunert and Bruno Lillefors are good examples of this. But this notion of an animal in an environment behaving naturally as a subject for painting without any inclusion of a human being, a hunter in a flak jacket in the background, none of that, is something that really becomes typified by some of the late 20th century greats like Bob Bateman, John Searle, Lester, Terry Isaac, all these guys that we're familiar with. And one of the things that all this work has in common is that there is a documentarian aspect to it. And I think this is where the sort of cutting edge of the art world, and particularly anything in the sort of, realm of postmodernism, really sort of turns its nose up to wildlife art, because it's like, oh, well, you're not talking about the human condition, you're not talking about, whatever. You don't have to have a 5-paragraph essay on the wall for us to understand what the hell it is you're looking at. It's very surface level to them. Now, I would argue that living in the time that we're living in, with our struggle to find balance between the natural world and our own role as stewards on the one hand and exploiters on the other, makes wildlife art terribly relevant to the human condition. But again, from the standpoint, I think, of a lot of academics, it's this documentarian aspect, particularly arising out of something very practical, like science illustration, that tends to keep wildlife art from really getting the due that I think it deserves. And when we talk about that documentarian aspect, what we're really talking about is these paintings having a narrative, but it's a natural historical narrative. So from there, what is contemporary wildlife art? So all that I'm talking about when I talk about contemporary wildlife art, and admittedly it's a clunky term because, technically speaking, anyone who's painting wildlife today who's alive is a contemporary wildlife artist. But for lack of a better term, and I think it's more or less how it has been used. It's not a term that I coined, it's been used. I am one of many people who is popularizing it, I hope. But what we're talking about is art in which animals are the primary subject, in which the artist incorporates various styles, mediums, treatments that have typically, historically, only been seen within the context of modern art. So what are those things? We're talking about abstraction. So this is an older piece of mine. This was called Nut Hatches Like Doilies, because they could. So the notion is that I liked the sort of way that there was a dialogue between the smallness and the fragility of the nuthatch and the daintiness and the fragility of the background pattern, which was used with a doily as a resist at one time during the painting process. But again, it's non-objective, that these shapes in the background do not correspond to any objective reality, which makes it abstract. From there, we move into stylization. And it's really important to draw a distinction between stylization and abstraction. As in this piece, which was a painting I did at Amaryllis years ago, the flowers are definitely representationally realistic, but as we move down the stem to the bulb and then back up to these other areas, I have stylized the leaves. They're still identifiably leaves, it's still identifiably a bulb. You can tell what it is. It does in fact correspond to an objective reality, but I have redesigned it in a way, in this case with sort of an Art Nouveau vibe, to communicate what it is, but to communicate my interpretation of what it is, not what it is in and of itself. And then from stylization, we move into a very key point, and this is something I'm going to talk about a lot, is flatness and pattern. So this is a piece from my quote-unquote modern camouflage series. And this notion of the surface of the painting being like a flat decorative plane rather than a space with perceptible depth is a real key element in modern art that, again, I'll talk about in more detail in a moment. Another hallmark is non-objective space and color. This is a painting from a few years ago called The Blue Bunny. Now, obviously, we know bunnies aren't blue. Why paint it blue? The reason that a lot of artists, particularly within a modern paradigm, start using non-objective color or non-objective space is that sometimes taking something that's familiar and recontextualizing it causes the viewer to look at it in a different way. We're all familiar with bunnies. What happens when the bunny is blue? Do we see it differently? And what does that suggest? So non-objective color is another biggie. And the other, and probably the primary, is concept. Now, I joked a little while ago about the 5-paragraph essay on the wall in the gallery. There's actually a really great website called Artie Bollock's Generator. It's a random artist statement generator. So you go in there and, like, let's say you wanted to, have one of those fancy artist statements on the wall about what your work is and the inspiration that you draw from, etc. You click a little button and it generates just this utter gobbledygook. But it's very clever, the format they use. They really do read like the worst of the artist statements that you've read on gallery walls. Where you stand away from it, you just kind of go like, oh, please. You just can't draw is what it is. And again, concept is something that's very important to me, and it's definitely something that's very important within contemporary wildlife art. The painting has to be about something. It has to say something. It has to say something beyond, here's the animal in its environment behaving naturally. Not because there's anything wrong with that, but because it's something that I did for so long, it no longer interests me. And I'm more interested now in how I can take the subject matter and spin it into something that does interest me. So this is a piece I did years ago for a client. It's just a particularly good example of a piece that's very conceptual. It's hard to see in this image, but the back end of the white tiger is actually a graphite drawing, and it slowly bleeds into a fully finished painting in the front. He's walking through a bunch of paint cans. As he steps in the paint, the colors bleed up into his fur. There's a peacock on his back, and its tail is transitioning into paint chips. This was for a client to celebrate, a very long-term client of mine, to celebrate his and his wife's, I want to say 30th wedding anniversary, and all of the names on the paint chips. I really want that job, naming paint chips, which is like, why is that particular gray called elephant gray? It doesn't look like elephant. But all the little paint chips are actually, all the colors are named for things of personal significance to him and his family. But again, a great example of a piece that has a really strong concept, and where the elements that are in the painting are there to serve the concept. And that's the real important part, is that I'm not painting something just to paint it and trying to shoehorn a concept into it. I'm deliberately selecting the things that I'm going to paint because they fulfill the idea. And that's, again, another hallmark of the contemporary in general, but certainly the contemporary in wildlife art. All right. So a little bit about how I started. So this is me at my very first one-man show, which was 20...
long fucking time.
Yes, I'm gonna defer to my father. It was a long fucking time ago. When was it? I honestly, So let's see. I graduated from college. Oh yeah, so it was 2001. That's what it was. It's spring of 2001. Hello. Yeah, so this was spring of 2001. This was at Pacific Wildlife Galleries in Lafayette, California. Now this is the gallery that I had been going to from the time I was 13 with a portfolio tucked under my arm, earnestly trying to get the gallery owner to hang my paintings. Now bear in mind this was a gallery that carried Robert Bateman, Carl Brenders, John Siri Lester, and not just prints but originals by these artists, and had big book signings and things for them. This was in the very heady days of wildlife art this would have been in the early 90s at that time. And at the time, you have to understand that I was a little bit of an art celebrity in the community. I was winning contests from the time I was a really little kid. Everybody thought I was so great. Yes. Dennis Salvo, who owned that gallery, was the most laconic person I've ever met in my life. The only thing he could talk about with any enthusiasm at all was art. But even that, you really had to rattle his cage to get some interest. So instead of heaping me with praise, he would give me sort of like, and then as I brought work in and brought work in and brought work in and kept coming back, I would get slightly more vigorous nods. You know, one day I might get a I was like, ooh, that sounded like a good and that kind of encouragement, which is to say very minimal encouragement, is exactly what I needed. Because at the time I first went in there, I had not a prayer in hell. I didn't belong in that gallery. But I didn't know that. And again, that's one of the things that I've learned over the years. My career started so early, I didn't know what I shouldn't do, so I just did stuff, which has served me very well. So eventually, by the time I was 16, I got my first painting on the wall in that gallery, and then almost immediately after graduating with my Bachelor of Fine Arts, I had my first solo show, which was a sellout. And those were the days where you could hang 30 paintings and sell 30 paintings. It was pretty spectacular. At that time, I was painting in a more, what I would say, traditional paradigm, but I was also mixing in a lot of different stuff. And a lot of this was because of my art history education. And I think one of the problems, and one of the reasons why a lot of wildlife artists stay in this sort of Bob Bateman ecological art paradigm for so long, is because wildlife art is very insular. It's its own little ghetto. And there are wildlife artists that I know who have not studied any art except the art of other wildlife artists. When there's this whole other world of art out there. And it was really that, immersing myself in other art styles, other art genres, that allowed me to pull those things into wildlife art and reinterpret it. A piece like this is a good example of something that was, again, much more in the sort of late 20th century ecological wildlife art paradigm, but it wasn't long before I started doing pieces like this. My phone just beeped, which this is the time when I'm going to retroactively say, everyone please silence your cell phones. There we go. Airplane mode on. Okay, so the weird technique that I have used for many, many years, or well, decades now, this building up of paint and sanding down, really started with this body of work. And the way it began was when I was in college. I went to a small liberal arts college, St. Mary's in Moraga, California, and we were asked to do a knife painting. Now, I've always been an implied rather than an applied texturalist. I had never done a big goopy painting slathering on paint, you know, like peanut butter. Just had never done that before. It was very anathema to my sensibility and my sense of refinement as an artist. And I hated the result. I was told that it was good. I didn't like it. And at the time, we were really being encouraged to build our own canvases. You know, like craft was a big thing. And I didn't want to discard the canvas, so I thought, well, how do I do a painting that I want to do on this canvas that's all chunky? I know, I'll just put 5 or 6 layers of gesso over it to fill in all the little cracks and valleys, and then sand the whole thing down, shear off the peaks, and what I'll be left with is an equalized smooth surface. Well, of course, when I did that, what I got was this field of white with all these beautiful, dark, sort of marble patterns arising out of it. It looked very much like if you're flying over the Rocky Mountains and you look out the wing of the plane and you see the black spines of mountains peeking out through fields of white. And I thought, well, that's really cool. What do I do with that? And I ultimately decided to glaze over it with some color. So you still saw the pattern, but it wasn't white anymore. And to paint a bird in flight across it. And this became what actually my mother named this series, the Resurrection of Flight series. I don't know if you remember that. You're always good with titles. And the idea was that I was sort of revivifying what I considered to be a bad painting, repurposing something. So for a long time, anytime I would feel like I had really screwed up a painting, I would take any of the little pots of leftover paint from other paintings, spackle them onto that board, let it dry, paint it over with gesso, stand it down, and then whatever that gave me, I would find a way to be inspired by that, to incorporate an animal subject, and then my job was to sort of weave that animal subject into this non-objective ground and have it make sense in that environment. And this was, again, I believe this is Resurrection of Flight number 5, which is the last of that series. So I want to move on to this one, and the lovely people who own this very special painting are actually here in this audience. This piece is called Indigo, and what makes this a very special painting, is that up until this point, I was doing very detailed animals against abstract backgrounds, and this was the first piece where I allowed the abstraction and stylization to bleed over into the animal subject itself. So, this first bird is very detailed except for its tail, which starts to bleed out into stylization. A lot of that's done with this impasto sand down. This bird is almost exclusively done that way. This one you can see is just fading off, like part of him is just sort of lost. The patterns here on the feathers, again, are done with that impasto. But it was the first time I had really done that, but in a targeted way. So I wasn't just spackling the paint on the board anymore. I was actually putting it on where I wanted it to go in a very deliberate fashion, and hoping that when I sanded it down, it gave me something close to what I wanted that I could actually work with. This was also my first painting in the very competitive Birds and Art show, which is a show I wanted to be in for many, many years. So there's a close-up of that piece.
Did that make the cover of?
No, I didn't. I did have a piece on the cover of Wildlife Farm magazine, but that was the flamingo painting in a similar style.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, which is the one that Chris wishes he had.
Yes,
So,
correct.
yes. I want to dive back a little bit into art history and talk about, I said I was going to come back to this notion of flatness, which is really important. So from the mid to late 1800s, really up into the advent of postmodernism, you can boil down all of the various art movements, of which there are many, into this primary argument. Is the canvas a window or a wall? Do we treat the canvas, the board, the substrate, whatever you're painting on, as a space that we could legitimately step into with Renaissance perspective and believable depth? Or do we treat the board as a flat surface to be decorated? And this is a very old landscape of mine. I don't know, this is probably from the early 2000s, called Down Gumtree Lane. A good example of a very it's a little modernist because I've decided to tilt the horizon line as if you're one of the birds that's flying down the road. But again, in terms of its treatment of the board, it's very traditional. It is Renaissance perspective. It has depth. You are meant to feel like you could step into that space. And then this is a detail of one of my modern camouflage pieces, which looks very much like wallpaper, and that is deliberate. So all of this really starts with Manet. This is a very famous Luncheon on the Grass, and this is one of those pieces that you could talk about for a week in an art history class. But what's really interesting about it, and again, you have to recognize that this painting was panned at the time that it came out. And it was because a lot of the things that Manet was doing that were really visionary were misinterpreted as incompetence. So the gentlemen in their black coats, they almost become like cardboard cutouts. They feel very flat, very pasted on, as does her. Manet very deliberately used this weird front lighting to flatten out her shape. If you have side lighting, you get a shadow, of an arm against the breast against the torso. You don't get any of that when it's head-on lighting. Again, he's deliberately trying to flatten her out. This figure in the background is totally out of scale to deliberately screw with our perception of depth. It's not all the way where he's going to go, but it's a very interesting place where we're being toyed with, where our ability to perceive what is something we could reach out and touch and what is something we couldn't is being messed with in a very deliberate fashion. And that's 1862, and by 1911 we have Matisse's The Red Studio, which is an interesting painting because we do have little lines that indicate a very rudimentary and crude sense of Renaissance perspective, but it's absolutely, any sense of depth you might have is obliterated by the treatment of the entire painting in red. Now, Matisse was inspired at the time by Persian miniatures in particular, and if you know anything about Persian miniatures, you can see that pedigree here. But it's really a revolutionary painting, and one that, again, is deserving its place in the annals of art history because it is a very specific benchmark of artists doing paintings of real things in the objective world, but painting them in a way that does not represent them, but rather that reinterprets them as shapes on a flat plane. So what I started thinking about is what I could do with that. And to tell that story, I need to go back in time a little bit to this painting. This is William Harnett's After the Hunt, or one of several After the Hunts. I had the great privilege to have a really wonderful 5th grade teacher, Mary Stevenson, who I stayed in touch with up until she passed away just a couple of years ago. And Mary would introduce us to a different American artist every week. There was a whole corner of the room that would be, images of that artist, and we'd have to do a report on them. And I remember just being floored by William Harnett. So William Harnett, John F. Pato, John Haverly, all these guys were very famous for what we refer to as, and this is a school of art that begins in Europe, but they're part of an American re-envisioning of that, the American trompe-l'oeil school, trompe-l'oeil being French for fool's the eye. And the idea was that artists would paint commonplace everyday objects, their actual size, in a highly detailed way, so with Renaissance perspective, so as to convince the viewer that they were looking not at a representation of that object, but at that actual object itself in real space. And I had the great privilege again to see a retrospective of the American trompe-l'oeil painters at the Young Museum when I was, I think, in my early teens. And that was a show that I just never forgot, had a very profound effect on me. And one of the things that I started thinking about when I was in college and learning about this battle between the illusionistic and the flat, about depth versus decorative, was to recognize how clever the trompe-l'oeil painters used surface. So if you're looking at a painting, no matter how realistic it is, of a person looking out a window, it could be completely photorealistic, but as you move around that piece, as you shift from side to side, as your perspective shifts, it creates a parallax that causes the image to torque. And then, of course, you understand immediately that you're technically looking at a flat surface that represents depth, not at the actual depth itself. What the trompe-l'oeil artists did that was so clever is that they typically painted in very shallow depth of field, of just a few inches or maybe a foot. So it might be books on a bookshelf. John F. Pato did this wonderful series of letter racks. I mean, they're paintings of nothing. It's letters and stuff, thumbtacked to a board. But they look so real because he's only trying to convince you that you're seeing this much depth. And After the Hunt is an example. There's probably the thing that's closest to us is the edge of this horn. So we're talking about maybe 10 inches of depth. So the irony was that for these artists to convince us of depth of field, they did so through an extremely clever painting of surface. And that little idea is something that led me to this. So this is from my period of doing trompe-l'oeil still life paintings. The idea that I had was, okay, so if the best example of a treatment of flat depth, of a treatment of the board or the canvas as a surface to be decorated is a purely abstract painting, I'm going to do purely abstract paintings. These are mostly color field paintings. And then I'm going to sit actual objects on them, light them, photograph them to record the cast shadows, and then I'm going to paint the objects as though they are resting, again, in actual size on the surfaces of the painting. So, and in so doing, what I thought was just terribly clever is that I was repositioning the actual abstract painting as a representationally realistic surface within the context of the painting. So that idea took me a number of years. I don't know how many of these little still lifes. Most of them were quite small. This is the last one I ever did. It's huge. It's 24 by 48. This is just a tiny little detail of that, because again, the pocket watch is life size. So that was sort of my first foray into really very deliberately using my art history knowledge to pursue a thematic within the work and to really explore concept. And again, to use the various elements as I was painting, not simply as, oh, look how cleverly I can paint a watch, but I'm cleverly painting a watch for a reason because I need to say this with it. And that was something that really guided, I think, every other painting I did since in one way or another.
Do you still have that poem?
I do, yes. That's one of those paintings. So there's a term called collection of the artist, which means shit that you didn't sell. But it's quite fascinating because among my collection of the artists are some of my most pivotal paintings that I've ever done. And I think what happened is twofold. I think on the one hand, it's that the pieces were, and if I can't say this without sounding egotistical, I don't care. I've worked very, very long and hard to have an ego, so here it is. Some of those paintings were ahead of their time, and I did them at a time when there was almost, that I could count on one hand the other people in the larger contemporary art marketplace who were doing anything that was even in my neighborhood. Now, I'm not talking about how good it was. I'm just talking about the ideas, the style and whatever. So there wasn't a movement for me to follow into. Funnily enough, within a few years of me getting tired of doing modernist trompe-l'oeil still life paintings, a whole genre of modernist still life paintings arose, exemplified by a lot of the artists like Waichulis, who were initially selling out of John Pence Gallery in San Francisco. And I don't know to what extent I influenced that, quite possibly not at all. It may have just been the right time for it. It was in the zeitgeist and it just happened. The point is that I did it before I think a lot of people were ready for it. And again, I did sell a lot of those paintings, but I sold the small ones. My one attempt at doing a big grand still life sat on the wall of gallery after gallery after gallery, and now I'm very glad that I still own it.
I would like to interject here.
Yeah.
The shit that didn't sell, Andrew calls us. I go to his studio often, and he has been offered on that particular painting money no fewer than a dozen times. So I find it ironic that it hasn't sold, as in many of the other paintings that haven't sold, even though there have been countless.
Yeah, it's been in the collection of the artist too long.
Yes.
It's now a personal thing that I don't want to part with. But yes, to your point, you have tried to
double and triple retail, and yet it still hasn't sold. So I just want to get the retailer's perspective.
Thank you. I appreciate that clarification. Even though this is a very different painting from what you just saw, it's very related in terms of the concept that it explores. So this is the aforementioned Modern Camouflage series. This is probably my favorite of those pieces. Now I had this idea, ideas come in all sorts of different ways, and some of the most potent ones come sort of like a thunderbolt. You just have an image enter your head, and you go, ooh, wow, that's really cool. The scary thing about that is that you're not always sure how to get it out. And this idea I had, it was literally just, I had this very strong vision of owls emerging from wallpaper. I have no idea why. It was an idea that I sat on for at least 2 or 3 years. And I just thought about it a lot. I kept returning to it in my head. And what scared me was, how am I going to paint representation of realistic owls that I want the viewer to feel like they can reach out and touch on a completely flat, non-objective patterned surface and have the piece hold together? How are they not going to look like I've just pasted them on there? And what do I have to do to bridge that gap between radically different, not just styles, but modes of expression, the illusionistic versus the flat? And the answer was very little, which came to me again, very much like a thunderbolt. And what I realized was that by having just the tiniest areas, like here, that even though in the broader context of the painting from across the room, it's realistic birds against a flat background, just having one area with the suggestion of a cast shadow and a talon kind of curling right, you can see this little shadow there, that those little places actually recontextualize the flat pattern as something three-dimensional in real space. And the very point of the painting, what makes it such a potent idea and what makes it so tension-filled and interesting, is that you cover that up or you move just a few inches away and all of a sudden you're in flat pattern again. So to me, there was something kind of magical about that juxtaposition, about how I could have something very, very flat next to something very, very real, and they interact in a way that is, to me, really, really fascinating. So that's really what those paintings came about. So as I worked on this series, It's a very short jump from pattern and repetition of the kind I was doing early on with just, damask patterns or sort of wallpaper-like patterns to other areas of art in which pattern is very relevant. And certainly, Andy Warhol's soup cans come to mind, as do Wayne Thiebaud's numerous desserts. Now, the curious thing is I'm actually not a big fan of pop art, and I'm particularly not a big fan of Andy Warhol or Wayne Thiebaud from the standpoint of visually. But it's worth noting that Andy Warhol painted these soup cans. I'm bad at math, but a long time ago, and we're still talking about them. And the same with Wayne Thiebaud. And what did interest me about these artists, again, was not the visual that they achieved, but the concept. This idea of taking the mundane and playing with it in this manner. And really, pop art, some of you have heard me give this spiel, I'm sure, but I'll repeat myself. Pop art really arises out of the post-war prosperity of the 1950s that made manufactured goods, once a luxury, suddenly commonplace to the point of mundanity. And artists like Warhol, like Thiebaud, at least in these particular pieces, are sort of humorously poking fun at our own excesses. They are deliberately taking this idea of branding and repetition and consumerism and playing with it. And ultimately, it's a very serious topic, but they're doing it in a very whimsical and playful way. So I started thinking, how can I do that? Come on. And along this line, too, I want to spin off to the side for just a second and talk about this idea of branding and logos and animal imagery in popular culture. And it's interesting to note that at this time, and again, it's another thing that I think makes wildlife art so relevant today, is we have never been so disassociated from the natural world in which we live, the natural world that gave birth to us. And yet, our imagery is steeped in it. So, we put cheetahs on our shoes because we identify with their speed. We put eagles on our currency because we identify with their strength. I've never figured out the Playboy rabbit. I don't know why that's Oh no, they have sex a lot. There you go. Just occurred to me. So, all these animals are being used as sort of stand-ins for elements of the human condition. But they're doing so in a very stylized way that is completely removed, disassociated, recontextualized, if you will, there's that word again, from their natural origins. And today, I know I'm going to sound very old, but, whoops, sorry. Kids today are worse than just looking at those brand logos. They're looking at these. They're looking at apps. And with very few exceptions, these app icons are completely and entirely abstracted and disassociated from their natural origins. The little Twitter bird, which, by the way, is it still around or is it replaced with an X now?
X.
Okay. Yeah. Well, shit, I have to update this lecture. Anyway, but I mean, the Twitter bird is the only one on this entire screen that looks like, and there's a little elephant. These are the only two that look like a thing that corresponds to an objective reality. I mean, how letters are abstractions. They're abstractions of sounds. So the idea is that these images start moving further and further and further away from the things that inspire them. There's a really great book that I read a few years ago called Naming Nature by Carolyn Yu, which I highly recommend. It's basically about the history of binomial nomenclature, which sounds dry as dirt, but is not. And the main point that she makes is that when human beings were living in small communities, and you might only travel a few square miles or 50 square miles in your entire lifetime, you would know the names of every single plant and animal in your local environment. And you would have categorized them with the help of your community into things that can kill me, things that I can kill, things that I can eat, things that I can't eat, things that are good for me, things that are bad for me, these things are poisonous. What can I use for its skin to keep warm? What can I use for its bones to whittle tools? All of these things you would know because they were relevant to your daily life. And that's the point that we're at now, is because we're living in a society that is so technological, we are not familiar with the things around us anymore because we have convinced ourselves that they are no longer relevant to us. And sadly, most of the time, we're right. If you're living in the heart of a big city like San Francisco, you may never encounter nature at all. I remember vividly when my cousin and my aunt, who live in Pacific Heights, were at our house in Orinda, which is kind of like a suburban area in the East Bay, the San Francisco Bay Area. And came inside all excited. This was like at a family gathering. And said, "Oh my God, we just saw this amazing bird. What was it?" It was a scrub jay. And it just shocked me that this bird that I saw almost every day, they had never seen, and to them it was something terribly exotic. And then I thought, well shit, when I'm in the city, what do I see? Pigeons, which are completely maligned, by the way, unjustifiably so, but that's it. So this notion of like not knowing what's around you, not being around you, is a real disease today. And one of the points that Carol makes in her book is that it's fairly well documented that there is a finite amount of space in the human brain for names. Most people can maintain, with immediate recall, about 2,000 names of things. You know, as we get older, and I'm only 45, but I'm feeling it. No, shit, I'm 46. You know, you have that dialogue with yourself, like I used to know this. Well, I learned something new, so I forgot that. That's not a joke. You forget stuff because it's being supplanted with other things. So the people, and you know, in some of the, I don't want to say primitive, but some of the cultures in the world that have not been industrialized, westernized, some of the native peoples of Papua New Guinea, there's some Amerindians in South America, people who live in very aboriginal tribes. These people still maintain the knowledge of their local environments, and they're part of huge studies of quote-unquote folk taxonomies. When Alfred Russel Wallace went to Papua New Guinea and was the first Westerner to record all of the birds of paradise, he was very intrigued to discover that the local Papua New Guineans had recorded the exact same number of species as he did. Now they called them something different because they were their birds, but he came in and wanted to call them something else. And this is really what necessitated the development of Linnaean taxonomy, is if you lived in your own little community, you only knew 50 names of birds and plants and animals, or 100 names or 200 names, what happens when you start going all over the globe and bringing back other animals and trying to understand what this bird is and that bird is in context to the ones that we know? And that's really what led to this broader system of naming, which is now being completely revised with genetics in mind rather than just sort of the surface level morphological similarities that Linnaeus originally used in his classifications. But now you have people growing up, especially young people, where the things that they need to be able to recognize immediately are these. Not the bird that's outside their window, not what they can eat, none of that stuff. These are the things that on a daily basis, in order to successfully conduct their lives in popular culture, friendships, socially, and in business, they actually need to know. I mean, if you were in a business meeting and said, hey, somebody said, hey, bring up Yahoo, and you didn't know that that was a little Y, or bring up Twitter and you didn't know that it was a little bird, that would be a significant problem. So it makes perfect sense that this is the direction that we've gone, but it's to the detriment of a relationship with an understanding of nature. And that's really what inspired the series of paintings that you see on the walls here, the pattern series. So the first time I really pursued this was in a show at my Jackson Hole Gallery in 2017 called A Different Animal. And what I wanted to explore was animals from the standpoint of mass production. So I did a lot of stuff with livestock, and the idea was to deal with animals that have been highly commodified. You know, the poultry and particularly the egg industry generates billions of dollars a year. It feeds millions of people. It generates hundreds of thousands of jobs. And yet how often do we actually pay tribute to the humble chicken? Almost never. So that was something that I wanted to deal with in that series. The other issue was ubiquity. And this is more the line in which the work that you're seeing today falls into. Animals that we see on a daily basis that are such a part of our life, and particularly common animals that are also woven into the suburban landscape, we get to a certain point where you see them enough, you stop seeing them. You know, you just sort of, there's an old saying, familiarity breeds contempt. You know, I'm someone who I never get tired of seeing my favorite birds, but I know a lot of people, oh, that's a raven. And don't even be started on professional birders. You know, you're out with professional birders and you're like, oh my God, that's the most beautiful specimen. It's on my life list already. I already saw it. I don't care. Like, and I'm not joking. You know, it's like there's a lack of wonder. They've lost that because they know it. And now that they know it, they don't need to know anything more about it. And I would question, so you saw that bird once and checked it off your list. Does that mean you know everything about it? I would venture it does not. But unfortunately, that's the attitude sometimes. So the other idea with the pattern series was the idea of reproductive capacity. So this piece is called multiplication tables, and I was really playing around with the notion of, well, you have one rabbit, you have two rabbits, suddenly you have 20 rabbits. And you know, again, it gets back to the sort of playfulness and the whimsy that I wanted to bring to this series. But also, I brought in non-objective color, and I did two versions of this painting, different pose rabbits, but the same general composition. One, they were in natural colors, and then this one, I wanted them to have you know, the same sort of color as Easter eggs. And that was a very deliberate nod to both the Christian Easter, or if you prefer, the pagan Yastre, and the notion of rabbits representing life, death, rebirth, spring, vitality, etc. And the non-objective palette only serves to enhance that. So,
Remember, Andrew, when we had eggs?
yes.
And chickens that laid eggs in our yard.
You know, it's a wonder that I love birds as much as I do, because those chickens were probably my first serious bird experience, and that was a traumatic experience. Chickens are not friendly with each other.
No, they're not friendly with each other.
Yeah. I still remember, Dan, the one that they all pecked its eyes out and you decapitated it, and you having this very gentle talk with me about how it was a mercy killing. I was 5, and I understood it.
Wow.
Yeah. I always remember that. So the pattern series then starts to develop in a different direction. This piece is called The Usual Suspects from a few years ago. And the idea was, I started thinking, well, I've got all these paintings where there's an animal and it's kind of on display in front of a mass-produced image of itself. What if the animal itself actually gets lost in the pattern? So that was the idea behind this painting. The other idea, I wanted to create a sense, this is a big piece, it's 48 by 48, the same size as the orange ravens against the wall. I also wanted to create a sense of continuation of the pattern, like you were looking at something that was sort of endless. So this tail belongs to this bird, that head belongs to that tail. So it kind of creates a sense of wrapping around like a zoetrope. That was a really important element of those paintings that I wanted to incorporate. And then the silhouettes themselves kind of become a vessel for abstraction. But the fun part is that from across a room, you read it as, oh, what an interesting raven wallpaper. It's not until you get within optimal viewing distance that you start to notice that, yes, we in fact have two very representationally realistic ravens that are sort of plunked into the middle of this. And the only thing that distinguishes them from the other birds as representationally realistic and not flat is the lighting and these little whispers of cast shadows. So then I did this piece, which is actually called The Usual Suspects 2 Desert Heat. And I love The Usual Suspects, it's a great movie. And I picked that because ravens are kind of tricksters, and I thought against the light, they sort of look like they were in a lineup, you know, because ravens are always getting it up to something. And I thought, well, but what if I wanted to paint ravens in a context where I could really feel like the heat of our desert environment and these tough-ass ravens existing in that space. So it's a similar composition, different birds, and this one was really fun. I actually got to spend some time with one of the ambassador ravens at the Arizona Sonoran Desert Museum to photograph the birds for this painting. And then this was a great opportunity to work with a very different palette. I don't think I had ever worked with a palette quite this bright and colorful, and it's no accident either that what I'm using are red oranges and blue greens. Red orange being the warmest color on the visible color spectrum, blue green being the coolest color on the visible color spectrum, just to play with that hot-cold contrast and make the whole thing pop as much as possible. And then more recently, this series has developed into a little bit more, and a bit more into some additional sort of conceptual elements. So this is a piece called American Grit that I did recently. And what I wanted to do in this piece was to play with the American bison as a symbol from two different distinct vantage points. One from Western settlers as a symbol of conquest and westward expansion, and the other from the Native American standpoint as a life giver and the backbone of the ecosystem and ecology of the plains, as well as their own ability to make a living within that environment. So you have some silhouettes with American flags and these silhouettes of stern-looking cowboys. You have some with Navajo patterns and then silhouettes of Native American heads. This is the Teton range here, and we've got a little dream catcher here, kind of hopefully alluding to some positive future for the American bison. This was also the first time that I had used these silhouettes in a paradoxically illusionistic way. So even though it's fairly loosely painted, this is intended to be a space that you can enter into, that you could walk into the scene with a split rail fence. So that was another development in the series that made this piece very different. But again, it still goes to the theme where, back to Andy Warhol's soup cans, the problem with the bison is the Americans, or the European settlers, saw it as an inexhaustible resource. They didn't understand that they could really eliminate this animal. But if you see pictures of the piles of skulls 100 foot high, you can understand how we actually did almost eradicate this very majestic animal. So again, in this case, even though it's a very colorful painting, even though it has some whimsy, very much like a lot of pop art, there's an underlying serious theme. I'm just dealing with it in a way that is, I hope, playful and not confrontational. But I do wonder, and I've yet to talk to my gallery in Jacksonville about this specifically, because I don't know the client who bought this. I mean, I know their name, but I've never met them. I always kind of wondered, is the person who buys this going to be the person who sees the American flags and the bison and goes, Merca? Or is it going to be the person who looks a little further into it and understands that what this painting is really about is about the schizophrenic nature of our relationship with nature as both destroyers and stewards? And I don't know the answer to that, but I hope that whoever has it appreciates it for the same reason that I painted it, but that's never a requirement. The check clearing is. So fast forward to this piece, and what I'm starting to do here, this is an interesting first full circle moment. So in this one, what I decided I wanted to do is not just have these silhouettes house abstraction, and not just have them house environments that represent where these animals live that you can walk into, but also to include, as it happens, a natural historical narrative. Prickly pear are one of the javelina's primary food sources, so I decided to incorporate those. In the painting of the coyotes, there's a little pattern of chipmunks, chipmunks and lizards and bunnies and the things that coyotes would eat, again, to sort of talk a little bit about in a non-objective or a very stylized context, nonetheless, to talk about what the animal does, how it makes its living in this environment of the Sonora Desert, which is an environment that I've really fallen in love with. Yeah.
Someday when I have a painting for Mother's Day, I will Bonnie Avelina and do a little Avelina.
I'm sure that can happen.
Andrew always loved pigs.
And before you change that slide, you and I are so used to this stuff, but Jane and I were having a talk, and I want you to explain to, because it's so hard, and I've had this question about a dozen times in the gallery. Are these digital overlays, is what it looks like? Of course, the answer is no, but can you explain inside these patterns, the average viewer who doesn't know your work, it's hard to figure out what in God's name are you doing? I know if you're coming around to that, but that is
so I'm
something.
going to talk a bit more about the actual process, but the shorthand is I create a stencil. All these silhouettes begin as ink drawings. I scan them into the computer, I digitally manipulate them until they're a little bit more cleaned up. I create the layout of the pattern. I have a company that prints it for me as a laser cut stencil on a low-tack PVC, so sort of like contact paper. That goes on there. And then whatever you see inside these patterns are between 5 and 20 step painting processes that all happen before the stencil is pulled off. Once the stencil is pulled off, then I put the positive of the stencil back over it to protect what I've just created do all this texturing in the background, paint over that, and then the entire thing gets sanded down with a power sander.
But to be clear, guys, just when you explain, the stencil is literally just the outline negative cut.
Yeah.
There's nothing, so it's just a,
Yeah.
he lays it out and there's just a hole.
And
Everything
the-
taking place inside is hand
I
painted.
understand that.
Well, we talk about that a lot on the gallery floor, because
Yeah.
it's hard to wrap your brain around what all of this stuff is. And so I don't want to interrupt
Yeah,
here
no, no,
there,
no.
but to one of his collectors who has a lot of his pieces, that was my question, is how the heck do you do that? We'll get into that.
And basically, if I'm doing something that isn't repeated, I'm transferring I would put masking tape over this area, transfer my drawing, cut it out with an X-Acto blade, and that's my stencil. Because there's no point in having it laser cut if it doesn't have to repeat. These areas, because it's really important to me that these not be close to each other, I want the silhouettes to be exact. So that really necessitates having them done by machine. But the only part that's being done by a machine is the actual die cutting of the stencil. The stencil itself, I'm creating. But because of the approach that I'm using, which you're going to see in some little video clips in a minute, one of the few things that I can't do well is go up to a very hard edge, which is why I will mask. So any place where you see me using masking is purely because the approach where I'm using this heavy, thick paint and glopping it on and putting it on with a kind of piping it on like cake frosting, one of the things I can't control is a hard edge. So that's the role that the stencils play. So, here we go. Okay, so about the process. So first and foremost, every painting begins with observation of nature. And I was coming to Tucson for a number of years with my partner Guy on a regular basis to teach workshops at the Arizona Sonora Desert Museum, like maybe twice a year. For many years before we decided to move here, I immediately fell in love with the Sonoran Desert, but particularly its most stately plant life, the saguaro. And ever since I've been coming here, anytime I see a really cool saguaro, and by really cool I mean one that's twisted or partly broken or that looks aged, or that, I love ones where like one arm is doing this and the other's doing that, and you can kind of almost read like a sense of turning or movement. I love it when the arms are touching the ground and it looks like an old man dragging suitcases. I love it when there's a couple arms that are out like this and it looks like you're being offered a gift. I love seeing multiple saguaros kind of smashed together and it looks like a bunch of people hugging or an orgy. I love the fact that it's very easy to anthropomorphize, to read human character into saguaros. I challenge you to see a lone saguaro on a hillside and not think for a fleeting instant, he looks lonely. I have this experience all the time. I'm out at night, I'm walking the dogs, it's dark, and I see the dark silhouettes of saguaros in the moonlight. And in the proper, in the wrong state of mind, they could look frightening. And in the proper state of mind, they're my guardians, they're sentries, looking after me in case a coyote comes running out of the darkness when I'm walking my little dogs. So I've kept for years this catalog, this very growing catalog of cool saguaros, and I painted some of them. This one is actually on Tumamoc Hill, and it's the one that I decided to use as the primary saguaro in this painting. And I have a lot of close-ups of it as well. This was just the one that I used as the primary view in the painting. So after observation, every painting gets a study. And at this point, my studies are, and that's what you're looking at here, are a combination of multiple elements. So I will take my photographs and manipulate them on the computer, then I will print them out at full scale, and then I will rework them. Because I'm still like a by-hand guy. The printout of the main image is a shortcut that allows me to get into the painting process quicker. But there's, when you blow up a regular photograph to 4 feet by 6 feet, it loses a significant amount of detail. So everything has to be redrawn. So I'm drawing back on top of the printout with black and white colored pencil, China marker, ink, and then I'm making some really big changes, like this saguaro. If I had turned a little bit when I was photographing, I would have seen more of it, but all I saw was this sticking out here. This part was not visible. Now I know that there was an arm and back coming down and that was coming out, but I couldn't see it. I thought, well, that looks hard to read. So this arm coming down through here connecting to this one is invented by observing about 8 or 10 other references of similar saguaros with similar arm structure in order for the drawing to make sense. So next I transfer it onto the board. So this is just a line pencil drawing on the actual board itself. I've covered over it all with masking tape. And now I've cut the masking tape away with an X-Acto blade. So underneath this masking tape silhouette is the drawing that you just saw with all the little details. But I'm doing this because now I need to paint a background color. So this is just a simple pass with a tinted gesso of a flat color. So next, I'm going to go back in time a little bit and talk about the process of making the stencil. So this is one of my ink drawings. So this is just like me with a little rapidograph and then some markers to fill in. That's probably about actual size, actually. So then scanned into the computer. These are my multiple different saguaro images, and I'm just starting to sort of place them into a pattern. That pattern is developing. And eventually, I ended up with this. And this is these are actually challenging to do because it's really important that I get these right, because these stencils, when I do order them, are not cheap. My last stencil order was $800. It's particularly time-consuming and difficult because I'm doing these files actual size because I have to, because they have to print with the same kind of clarity that I'm going for. So this image on my computer is a 4-foot by 6-foot image, which means I have to work on it in little sections because I can't stand back and see the whole thing at one time. So finally I render a file that the printer can use to die cut, and I end up with my stencil. This was, so the product that I use, the low-tech PVC, is only 48 inches wide, which means they can't print something like this all in one, or actually no, I'm sorry, it's 36 inches wide, so they can't print it all in one piece. So they have to print it in multiple pieces, and this was the guide that they sent me for how everything was to be pieced together. Just putting the stencil down was a day's work. So in this next image, so this next image is the actual stencil itself laid down over that the painting up to the stage that you last saw it. And next, I'm going to fill in each of these silhouettes with a flat base color of gesso. And this is both to establish the color, but also, I find that if I do this, it's easier for me to keep track of where I am and what I'm doing. And I do have a color study that this corresponds to, which again would have been just a print out of my digital logbook. So next, and this was one of the real differences with this piece, is that I had not done a piece where I did a detailed central subject and then a pattern in the background with patterns within the pattern. And the idea was I wanted to showcase the saguaro as the backbone of our ecological desert community. And that meant housing within each of the saguaros desert tortoises, roadrunners, desert cottontails, javelina, coyotes. And of course, I had already made those stencils for these paintings. I just resized them and printed miniature versions of them and used them in this context. So now here's where I'm going to describe a little bit about what I'm doing. So this is what you will hear Chris and I describe as the cake decorator technique or the plastic bag thing. So I'm mixing up a color and I'm putting it into a plastic bag, cutting a tiny little hole in the tip. And now I have this very thick, high viscosity paint that I can direct in a much more targeted way. And in this case, I'm using it for filling in these stencils, which it's not entirely necessary for this part of the process, but it is helpful because it allows me to be a bit more targeted, make sure I don't miss anything, and I also don't have to waste as much
Andrew,
paint.
in this video, is there any footage of you actually painting a figure with or animal with this
No.
process? So,
well, actually, no. Yes, there is. There's a thing where I'm doing the saguaro.
if not, there's a video called the Fox Project, because this little plastic bag he's decorating, he can actually render this animal almost perfectly with that plastic bag.
You actually will see that in this. But yeah, that until I get this the actual major video done of this saguaro process. This thing that I'm doing now is just the best I could do under the time constraints with images. But it makes a lot more sense if you see video. But yeah, on my YouTube channel, there's about 5 different videos. The Fox Project probably being my favorite one that show the entire process from start to finish. So here I've painted in all those little internal patterns. Here I've peeled the stencils off so you can see the silhouettes and the saguaros again with all the little animals housed inside them. And next, and a couple of you have pointed out that there's more than just the animal patterns in the saguaros, there's patterns within patterns. So at the next point, I'm putting another layer of very thick, high viscosity tinted gesso over it, and I'm pressing various things. I do a lot of my art shopping at hardware stores, so I might be pressing perforated sheet metal, knitting screens, I might be drawing in the thick paint. There's a really cool like veiny texture you get if you take a palette knife and press it against the wet paint and pull back. You get these neat little spidery ridges. So all of those things I'm using, I think I used a PVC gutter guard for one of the patterns, but I'm using all of these things in order to create yet another layer of pattern. And then I'm mixing a thinner gesso in a color just slightly different, color just a slightly lighter or darker value, painting that over it again, and at that point, I'm finally ready to take those stencils off. So at this point, I've done all of this work, and you can't see any of it because it's all been painted over, but you will see it in a few stages. So now I've pulled off the tape that was protecting my saguaro drawing up to this point. And now it's time to do what Chris was just talking about, and that is to do some actual work. Now here you're going to see what the impasto plastic bag cake decorator technique can actually accomplish. It can be used to create a lot of precision, but you have to recognize that all of this is very thick, chunky paint, but because I'm using this very fine little tool, I can direct it where I want it to go. This takes a lot of time, but you're going to watch this in time lapse because I think this little video I'm about to show you was about 40 to 50 minutes of work. You'll also keep seeing this gray thing entering the frame. That's an optivisor. As I get older, I find it helps eye strain a lot if I paint under 2x magnification. So I'm very calculatedly putting on the spines first because or actually the aerials that the spines go into because they're very integral to the structure of a saguaro and I don't want to risk losing them. So I'm making sure I do all of that, let that dry, then I'm going to come back in and put in the rest of the saguaro. So there it is where I've done all the little spine dots, but only that. So next I'm going to come in and you have to imagine me now, and actually this is the point at which Chris asked me to do this. So this is my palette for this painting. So each one of these, I should have counted how many colors there are, I didn't. But this is a bag filled with bags, and each bag is filled with a different color. So you have to imagine me doing all of this with these little things. And when I'm doing something like what you're about to see, I'm probably using 10 or 15, maybe 12 different colors. So I'm constantly going back and forth between bags. It's very chaotic. And some of the values, like I'll have, I think for this I had like maybe 10 different shades of green, and I had to create little swatches on a sheet of paper so I could keep track of them, and they're all numbered so I can remember which one, because some of them when you're looking at, so acrylic when it's wet looks about 20% lighter in value than when the color dries, which means when the paints are wet, it's really hard to distinguish between two similar values, like the values assert themselves when they dry. So I had to be very careful about labeling all of these so that I could keep track of, was I using my lightest green or was I using the second to the lightest green, because they look all too similar. So you're going to see here, and I want to say this that you're watching now is about 2 hours of work, maybe a little more than that. So very tedious, and you can see I'm coming in, I'm positioning the paint with the little plastic bag, I'm smoothing it out and pressing it with the little grooves with the palette knife.
And the message really gets driven in when you watch into an animal because of how much
Yeah.
control he has
Or
of
when
this
your
technique.
sister bumps into you.
Oh,
It's
please.
something that you
Anyway, so here is, this is the saguaro after I've completed that process. And I want to say that was at least 6 days. And don't cry for me or anything, Argentina, but you should know that I was really trying very hard to get this painting finished for this event. That was not possible. But there was about 2.5 weeks when I didn't sleep more than 4 hours a night. So when I say I spent 5 days on it, I mean 5 15-hour days. So this was a lot of energy in here. So the next stage is this. So at this point, if you remember when I first started talking about this process, it was all of the raised ridges and everything, but then putting a thinner gesso over it so that when I sand it down, everything's smooth again, filling in the cracks and valleys with a thinner coat. So that's what I'm going to do now. I've now mixed up about 15 or 20 thinner gessos, like a lower viscosity, in all sorts of different shades of green and gray, et cetera, and I'm now going to paint those over the thick impasto work. And the idea is that that thin paint will fill in all the little cracks and valleys, it will help clarify the value structure, and it will equalize the surface so that when I sand it down, all those lovely little details will emerge. And I'm using paint colors that have just enough contrast that they will really show off what is underlying. And that's how that looks after I've done that process. So then next is the part that really freaks people out, and that is using a power sander. I start with a 60 grit sandpaper. And this is probably my favorite part of the process because I've now worked on this mother for months. And it is within a couple of hours that I will see what I've actually done. So you can see that as I sand, all the underlying patterns and textures finally emerge. And this is a very scary process because it is really easy to hold the sander in one place for too long and suddenly you lost an animal's head, you lost an animal's foot, you lost an arm of your saguaro. So I've gotten very good at being quite cagey about it.
God, how often do you get yelled at?
He doesn't get yelled at.
No, I used to.
All right, so here it is with the, so this is how the painting looks after that initial sand down. So one of the things that I love about this technique is that no matter how controlled I am about it, no matter how much time and energy I put into perfecting this, no matter how well I've learned to predict how it's going to look, there are always surprises. There are always elements that look not quite like what I anticipated, and then my job to sort of work with them. Sometimes it comes out better than I thought. You know, it's a bit like the happy accident in watercolor, where that drip or bleed or splob that you couldn't have planned, didn't plan, ends up being the most interesting passage in the piece. Now in this piece, I was really pleased because I didn't have a lot of loss. Ever so often there's a place where you sand a little too deeply, you have to go in and sort of repair something. That's a real pain in the butt. I had to do very little of that here. But what I did notice when I stood back from it, after having spent months on it, was it was too damn busy. And I love the pattern, I love the colors, I love all of that, but what I ultimately decided to do is get out my masking tape yet again, mask the entire saguaro, and do a transparent gray glaze on the background to bring it to there. And you can see all of a sudden the saguaro pops out. And this is a great instance. I can't remember who it was, there's a famous author who said that writing is all about learning how to kill your darlings. You know, this notion that you can have a wonderful line of dialogue or a brilliant scene, but if it doesn't support the overall whole of what you're trying to create, you have to edit it out. The director, Peter Jackson, could learn from this. The Lord of the Rings did not need 18 endings. But this is something that really I try to be very true to, is that like no matter how cool something is, if it doesn't work in context, well, it doesn't work. So you can now see all those patterns. They're still there, but they're considerably lower in contrast. They're much more sedate. The color's a bit more washed out. And as I finish the piece, what that's going to allow me to do is make the saguaro really pop and be assertive, because the piece is ultimately about that main subject. And this is the last stage that I'm doing, and this is very important. The impasto underpainting gives me a wonderful armature on which to construct the rest of the painting. But there are places where I'm going to come in, slightly adjust color or value, push something back, pull something forward, increase contrast, add a little bit of detail, put in some highlighting. Eventually there'll be places where I'll need to paint in spines here. And that's what I'm doing here. But it's very important that that be done sensitively, because what I don't want to do is do all this work up to this point and then just paint over the thing. I want to use what this process has given me and bring out the best in that with minimal transparent and semi-transparent treatments. So this is me working on one of the arms. So the only two arms that I've done this part to are this upper arm here that's kind of peeking out from behind, and then the one big arm that's swooping down. So if you take a look at those, that's how the rest of the saguaro will look after I've had an opportunity to do that glaze work. And that brings us to me thanking you for your attention. So I'm very happy to answer questions if there are any.
I think we all applaud her.
Yeah.
I do want to emphasize that no one actually plans to work like this. It just evolves over time. Yes, Anne?
How do you know when it's
That's an excellent question. And I've actually really tried over the years. So I'll answer this by telling you kind of the process. There's the beginning of the painting where the light bulb goes off, you have the idea in your head. Usually that starts with seeing something, you're like, oh God, I have to paint that. And then you think about it, and the way to paint it comes into focus. And then it's really exciting. It's like falling in love. Everything's new, it's wonderful, it's exciting. And at that stage, everything that I'm doing is quick little staccato movements. It's, oh, work on the study. Well, that's not nothing, but it might take me a couple days. Then it's, ooh, maybe I'm going to build a background pattern, so I'm going to sit down and do my stencil. Again, not nothing, but that's a few days of work. Then you say, okay, well now I need to prime the board, get it ready, transfer the drawing. And all of a sudden, there it is. It's like that moment that you frame a house, where you can finally see what the house is going to look like, but no other part of the process will go that quickly from then on. From then on, it's all chipping away and going slowly and doing this and doing that. And there's the whole period of time where it's like, nothing's getting done. It's like, well, we're doing the electric. Yeah, but I don't see anything. It's very that. So I'll go through these stages where I've been in love with it, I'm excited about it, I started, and then the reality sets in, especially on big pieces like this where I think, oh God, what did I do to myself? Now I have to finish this fucker. And that is a realization that can actually be very challenging, where you may really need to step away from it. This is one of the reasons why I always work on multiple pieces, because if I really have that moment where like, I can't look at this for another day, I can move on to something else, I can come back to it. But you'll do that, you'll chip away, you'll chip away, you'll chip away. It's like that thing where the sculptor chips away at a stone to reveal the sculpture that's inside. There's long parts of that process where it's just, it feels like nothing's happening. But at a certain point, you'll stand back from it, and I'll have this realization, oh my God, it's starting to take shape. I really can do this. And then I'll get reinvigorated, I'll work on it some more, work on it some more, work on it some more. And then I'll have this moment where I look at it and I go, oh my God, it's actually almost done. And then I have this really weird feeling, which is, I'm really gonna miss this painting. It's like that moment that I had when I graduated high school, and I'm like, I'm really gonna miss this place. I'm like, what's wrong with you? You hate these people. It's like, the 3 people that you care about, you will keep in touch with. The rest of them, I mean, you might go to your reunion to see if they got fat, but that's it. So there's that moment where it finally becomes exciting again, and you are in love with it again, and then there's this just sort of wistful last touches, and there's a moment, usually a day, where I'm working very slowly, and I'm doing a little bit here, and a little bit here, and I'm staying back from it, and as many times as I've done that, and as many times as I have consciously thought in advance to remember this, I never remember the last brushstroke, ever.
Oh.
There's just a moment where you stand back from it, and you're about to do something. You're like, oh. Never mind. And it's just done. And it always feels a little magical which is ridiculous because I know the amount of work that's gone on to it, and I've chipped away on it very much by hand through this entire process. But there is something about bringing into being something that wasn't there before, that wouldn't exist without you, that is at its core nothing but colored goo applied to a substrate. And having it say something, mean something, tell a story. And that moment of realization is really wonderful. But try as I might, I can never pinpoint it. I will tell you that an artist friend of mine said, and I'm sure he's quoting someone else, but sometimes the difference between being good and being great is knowing when to stop.
Yes.
And that knowing when to stop.
Yeah.
And that's 100% true. It's so easy to overwork something. But that line, when do you stop, when is it, is something that purely comes from experience. And I sometimes have to remind myself that I started doing this when I was a little kid, and I've been doing it to some degree of professionalism since I was 16 and started showing in a gallery. And from the time I was 21, I've done it full time and nothing else. I put in a lot more than my 10,000 hours. And because of that, I've gotten to this point where a lot of the things that I used to have to actively think about, I now no longer have to think about. They become automatic. Like the first time that you drove somewhere you drove to 1,000,000 times and you pulled into the driveway and you had no idea how you'd gotten home. It's not because you didn't pay attention, it's because so much of it became by rote. You were operating on muscle memory. You did, and as a painter, you do this 100,000 times and your brain says, boy, he's doing that a lot. Let's myelinate the nerve sheaths from that point to that point. Let's replace that dial-up with broadband. And when that happens, things that used to be laborious become automatic. The real kicker is that rather than making you a more efficient painter, rather than making you paint more quickly, rather than upping your speed, all that does is open up new chasms of minutia that actually make the work take longer. Because instead of fiddling and thinking about, did I mix the right color? You're thinking deep thoughts, more important thoughts. And I think it's that reason, that evolution, that has caused concept to become such an important part of my work. I still remember when I decided to stop doing those Trompe-l'oeil still lifes, and it wasn't because I didn't love how they looked when they were done, and it wasn't because I wasn't, on some level, you get a charge and I'm like, wow, I really feel like I can reach out and touch that. I mean, I did a painting of a bag of chips where you could read the ingredients, and it was actual size. Like, I don't even think I could physically do that today. But you get to a point where you can do that, and it's no longer a challenge, it's no longer interesting. You have to move on to something else. Because once you've gotten to that point where you don't even have to think about it to do an incredibly complicated task, if you keep doing that thing, you lose your zest and your joy in it. And this is one of the reasons why I think that I've had some of the success that I've had, is that I'm always reinventing myself. I want to be the Cher of the wildlife art world. And I want that because there's a mistaken notion in our society that an artist has to have a signature style, they have to be known for something. Well, they do. I have a signature style. But Picasso had multiple signature styles throughout his lifetime because people grow and they change. It's only a few small-minded art critics and the occasional collector who falls in love with one style than ours did who wants that. So this is the pattern series. And between you and I, this feels like the culmination of the pattern series. I don't know how many more of these I will do. I'm not calling the series finished because I never know when I'm going to be inspired to do something, but I feel like I'm nearing the point where I've said what I need to say with these. I'm still working on totems, I'm still working on other things. I have a whole new idea for a completely different series that is going to be radically different from anything that I have ever done before that I'm not going to tell you about just now, but you'll see. And I'm thinking about that now. And it's because I'm continuing to grow and I'm finding different stages of my life and I'm allowing to be guided by the person that I am and the person I'm becoming to guide the next step in that process. And although I'm being very verbose here, that does, in a weird way, wrap back down to your question about when are you done. As an artist, you're never done. You're never done as long as you have ideas. Yeah. Other questions?
I just have one.
Yeah.
You used to do several different pieces at a time.
Yeah.
So if this did not get bored, you still do that?
I do, yeah. And unless I'm trying to meet a heinous deadline and working through a piece, I've almost always got multiple pieces going. And it's really important to do that because, and it's one of the differences between being a hobbyist artist and being a professional artist. If you're a hobbyist artist and you get sick to death of the painting you're working on, you can put it aside and you can go watch TV, you can do something else, that's fine. But if you're making your living, I can't afford to have a wasted day. So if I put the painting aside, and I don't want to keep working on it and screw it up, but if I put the painting aside, I have to be able to immediately pick up something else, get re-excited, reinvigorated, work on that, and if I hit a wall with that, I can go back to that other one. And frankly, having that distance between you and the piece is extremely important anyway, because it allows you to see problems that you might not before. There's a real tendency for things to start to look correct, not because they are, but because you're used to them. So walking away from the piece, looking at it a week later, and you weren't staring 2 inches from it for 10 days in a row, looking at it again with fresh eyes, you might see a compositional error that you missed. You might recognize that the lighting is off in this particular area. You might look at it and say, wow, that pattern is too busy, I need to glaze that back. Whatever it is, having that space and distance from the work is a really important element in that process. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you all very much. I hope I didn't rattle on too long.